Osio Negad, Stacey Daguado. I'm Stacey Leeds. I'm very honored to be here with you. First, I just wanted to thank Agua Caliente for hosting us once again, and to really thank Sarah and to thank Kelly for the MCs for the last couple of days. I didn't get to come here until really late last night, but on social media I got to watch this for the last couple of days, and I was very jealous that I didn't get to be here for the whole time. Jerry, thank you for your leadership in this event. I came here for the first time, the second annual event, and I've done a lot of growing up since then, and this conference has done a lot of growing up since then as well. And I don't just mean from going from 500 or 600 people in a year to 1,200, attendees. It's also kind of grown out to become this place where people come to get renewed, to go back and do the very difficult things that many of us do during the years. So I always feel a little bit funny when I'm on one of these firsts panels, because like so many of you that I know in this room, I got the opportunity to do some of the things that I've done just through 1,000 sets of circumstances that led to a particular point. And I'm up here this time over being the first dean of a law school that's a Native woman, and thank you. And one of the things when I took that job, for those of you who aren't familiar with geography, all the Cherokees in the room know that Fayetteville, Arkansas is the closest law school to Cherokee Nation, even closer than Tulsa in terms of the capital. But for the rest of the folks in the room that I've known from my time in North Dakota and Kansas and in Wisconsin, I got a lot of, well, good for you, but why on earth would you go to Arkansas, right? When I took that job, I had to step down from being a tribal judge at 6 different tribes at that time because this was a big job and I was going to have to devote all of my attention to that one thing for a while. And so, on one hand, I kind of thought, well, gosh, I'm still going to be able to be impactful in Indian country. I'm not giving that up. But the thing that always, like that earworm in the back of your mind is, I do this every morning. No matter what my role is, I get up and say, why on earth am I doing this thing at this time right now, and is there something else that I should be doing? And so for the young women in the room, just know this. When you look at a panel of people like us, there are no grown-ups in the room, ever, right? We are constantly saying to ourselves, even when we know that we are living our best day, is that really what you're supposed to be doing at this moment in time, right? So I thought what I would share with you is, just to give some context, my best professional day and my worst professional day over the last few years. And so my best professional day happened at the University of Arkansas when I was still the dean. I did it for 7 years, which all the Cherokees will know that that's a good number to quit on, so exactly 7 years. And And it wasn't one of these days where we got some new ranking or we got some big $1 million gift for the law school or something like that. My best day was just going through email one day, and I had an administrative assistant who's one of these very, very quiet individuals that it took a while for us to get to know each other because she had served 5 different deans in the past, and I was her 6th dean. And she, would not call me by my first name, and she would always knock and say she was sorry to interrupt. And so it took us several years to get past all of that, right? I'm Stacey, and you can interrupt me at any point. That's your job, it's my job. But she comes in one of these days fairly early on, and she knocks on the door, and she says, sorry to bother you, but there's a group of people in your conference room, and I don't know who they are, and they don't have a reservation. And I said, oh, well, who is it? And she said, I don't know, but when I asked them if they had a reservation for the room, they said no, that Stacey would be fine with it, and I just walked out of the door. So I walked through the attached door into this conference room, and there was about 7 Native students sitting there. It was pretty close to finals, and it wasn't a NALSA meeting that they had reserved the room for. They just were in there studying, right? And I thought about, that a lot, and I think about it frequently because, the takeaway that I have from that is, First of all, how cool is that, right? And second of all, it's a whole lot easier to have a conversation with a Native student to dial down their privilege one notch instead of convince them that they're entitled to be there too, right? So that was the best day. The worst day probably is very, very well known to many of you in this room because you've had several days, and the advocates in this room have had hundreds of more days like this than I could ever process, but it's about 15 years ago. And the first example that I described was that your mere presence matters always. It changes the dynamics. Whatever you do, your presence matters. I was a tribal judge for a tribe, and I was probably 27, 28 at the time. And I had a relationship violence victim in the courtroom, and she had been in there before, and she came there with her mom and her mom only. No attorney, no victim advocate, no police officers in the room to, be there for that hearing. It was just her and her mom, and they came in asking for a protective order. And of course, I granted the protective order, but I remember that day, and I'll always remember that day, because I could just look at the eyes of the victim and her mom and know that they viewed me as being somebody in a position of power and somebody who could help, right? But I left the hearing that day, and I knew in my heart that she would be victimized probably by the end of the week again. And I knew that legally I had given the piece of paper, right, that they had sought. But I also knew in my heart that that didn't matter, right? That was some tiny little, grain of salt, so to speak. And so I felt completely and utterly powerless to do anything to empower her, to stop the violence in that community. And so as I'm thinking about the worst day, I can still remember those faces and how I felt and how they felt, and we all just sort of knew, right? And one thing that I remember about that day, and one thing that I'm very grateful about today, is that for none of the tribes that I work with would that scenario play out today, right? There are networks and there are resources available where that wouldn't happen to the extent that it would have 15, 20 years ago. And so I'm grateful to each of you for being that larger part. But just like I thought about in that first story about every bit of your presence matters, what matters more sometimes is who's not present. And so, one of the things that I just want us to take away with is it takes every single person in this room. And if one of us is absent in a time that we could be there, then we all know that one dimensionality is never going to work. The last thing I'm going to say, and yield the rest of the time to my colleagues here, is for the young women in the room again too, right? Oftentimes when we think about our own individual paths forward, it's difficult to see where that next step is, and it's sometimes difficult even where you identify a place that you would like to be, and you think, wow, that is going to be very difficult for that to happen because there are unique difficulties that women, particularly Native women, have. And we've all heard the, slightly funny but not funny, comments like, wow, there's a woman candidate in the pool. I bet she is really going to have a hard time because she would have to walk backwards on water and in high heels, right? She would have to be completely excellent. And then, a similar phrase that I saw this week several times reposted across social media was this concept that we expect our women to work like they have no children, but then to raise children like they don't work, right? This exceptional excellence that we want from our women. And my takeaway is that sometimes you will have to have your card punched 3 more times than the next person. That probably will be the case sometimes. But there's also something very uniquely powerful about being a Native woman, and that is the one thing that you have that's so much more valuable than any card that you get punched is that you don't know how to be anything else except your authentic self. Don't change that. And then my final takeaway is this. I have been so excited this last month after this midterm election to see some Native women elected to Congress. To statewide offices. And many, many other firsts. But I just want to remind us all that with that power and the expectations that we have of state and federal governments that they do better, we have to be real and stay our authentic selves to make sure that we put that same pressure on our own tribal communities, right? They have to be as excellent too. And I know that there's a lot of tribal leaders in the room. Make sure that at the least, we hold ourselves to the same standards that we want everybody else to be held to. Thank you for your work.